Flight 712 from San Diego to Philadelphia touched down smoothly at 6:42 p.m. on a rainy Tuesday evening, 17 minutes ahead of schedule. The Boeing 757 taxied to gate B-18, and passengers immediately began gathering their belongings, eager to deplane after the cross-country journey. Overhead bins opened, carry-ons were retrieved, people shuffled into the aisle in the familiar choreography of arrival. Within minutes, the flow of passengers toward the exit was steady and orderly. Flight attendants stood near the doors, thanking people for flying, wishing them well. Everything was routine, normal, unremarkable, until everyone had deplaned except one man who sat unmoving in seat 8A, staring out the window at the rain-slicked tarmac. Aaron had been sitting 3 rows behind that man, in seat 11C, and had noticed him during the flight. Quiet, reserved, maybe in his mid-50s, wearing a dark suit that looked expensive but rumpled, as if he'd been traveling for days. The man hadn't eaten the meal service, hadn't watched the in-flight entertainment, hadn't read or slept. He'd just stared out the window for the entire 5-hour flight with an expression of such profound sadness that Aaron had wondered what tragedy the man was carrying. Now, watching everyone deplane while this man remained seated, Aaron felt that curiosity deepen into concern. Flight attendant Jennifer Park approached the man after everyone else had left. "Sir, we've arrived in Philadelphia. It's time to deplane." The man didn't respond, didn't even acknowledge her presence. Jennifer tried again, gently touching his shoulder. "Sir, are you feeling all right? Do you need medical assistance?" The man finally turned his head to look at her, and Jennifer was struck by the depth of pain in his eyes. He wasn't sick or confused, he was heartbroken. "I'm not ready to get off yet," he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. "I need a few more minutes, please." Jennifer hesitated. Protocol said all passengers must deplane after landing. The aircraft needed to be cleaned, restocked, prepared for its next flight. There were schedules to maintain. But something in this man's voice, in the way he clutched a small framed photograph Jennifer now noticed on his lap, made her pause. "Okay," she said softly. "A few more minutes, but then we really do need you to leave the aircraft." The man nodded and turned back to the window. Jennifer moved away, conferring with her colleagues and the gate agent about the delay. Something told her this was more than a passenger being difficult. This was grief. The gate agent was less understanding. "We need that aircraft turned around for the next flight. He needs to get off now." But Jennifer held firm. "Give him 5 minutes. Something is wrong. He's not just being stubborn." The agent sighed but agreed. Jennifer returned to the man, who still hadn't moved. She sat down in the seat across the aisle from him, 8C. "I'm Jennifer," she said quietly. "What's your name?" The man was silent for a long moment, then answered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Robert Morgan. Robert, can you tell me what's wrong? Why you don't want to leave the plane?" Jennifer's voice was kind, without judgment. Robert's hand tightened on the photograph. "Because once I walk off this plane, I have to face what's waiting for me out there. And I'm not ready. I'm not strong enough." Jennifer looked at the photograph, and Robert noticed. He held it up so she could see. A young man in military dress uniform, smiling confidently at the camera. Early 20s, handsome, with his whole life ahead of him. "My son," Robert said, his voice breaking. "Lieutenant James Morgan. He died 3 weeks ago in Afghanistan." Jennifer felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm so sorry." Robert nodded, wiping his own eyes roughly. "I just flew to Dover Air Force Base to receive his body. He's in the cargo hold, right now, below us." Jennifer's breath caught. She looked down at the floor, imagining the coffin in the cargo hold, and felt the weight of Robert's grief settle over her like a physical thing. This man's son was dead, in a flag-draped coffin somewhere beneath their feet, and Robert was about to face the reality of that loss the moment he walked off this plane. "But here's what made this even more heartbreaking," Robert explained, his words tumbling out now that someone was listening. "My wife died 2 years ago. Cancer. James was all I had left, my only child. He joined the Marines to serve his country, and I was so proud, but scared, always scared. And then 3 weeks ago, 2 Marines showed up at my door. 'We regret to inform you,' those words, those terrible words. And now I have to walk off this plane and claim his body, and plan his funeral and bury my son. And I'm not ready. I know I have to, but I'm not ready." Jennifer didn't know what to say. What could anyone say in the face of such profound loss? She just sat with him, present, bearing witness to his pain. Other flight attendants peered into the cabin, wondering what was happening, but Jennifer waved them away. This man needed time, needed space, needed someone to understand that for him, this plane was the last moment before his grief became fully real. Outside, the gate agent was getting increasingly agitated, but Jennifer didn't care. Some things were more important than schedules. Aaron, who'd been waiting near the gate to retrieve his checked bag, noticed the delay. Other passengers muttered about it. Why weren't they opening the gate? Why was the aircraft still occupied? Aaron approached a gate agent and asked what was happening. "A passenger is refusing to deplane," the agent said with exasperation. "We're trying to handle it." Aaron felt a flash of annoyance, then remembered the sad man from 8A and wondered if it was him. If so, Aaron's annoyance transformed into concern. That man had been carrying something heavy. Maybe he needed help. Back on the plane, Robert was talking more now. "The dam broken. I shouldn't have let him join the Marines. I should have talked him out of it. But he was so determined, so passionate about serving. He wanted to make a difference, and I couldn't tell him no." What kind of father stops his son from following his dreams? Jennifer shook her head. "You're not responsible for his death. He made his own choice to serve. That's honorable." Robert laughed bitterly. "Honorable? Yes, he died honorably. For his country. But he still died. And I'm still alone. And I still have to bury him. And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to say goodbye." Jennifer thought about her own life, her own losses. Her father had died when she was young. She remembered the funeral, the finality of it, the moment when denial stopped being possible and grief became real. She understood what Robert was feeling. This plane was his last refuge from that finality. Once he walked off, once he claimed James's body, denial was no longer an option. The loss became official, permanent, real. "Robert," she said gently, "I know you're not ready. But you'll never be ready. Grief doesn't wait for us to be ready. It comes anyway. But you're stronger than you think. You raised a son who was willing to die for others. That strength came from somewhere. It came from you." Robert shook his head. "I'm not strong. I'm broken." Jennifer reached across the aisle and took his hand. "Broken people can still stand up. They can still move forward. Not because they're not broken, but because they have to. Because their loved ones would want them to. Does James want you sitting on this plane forever? Or would he want you to walk off, honor him, celebrate his life, grieve him, and eventually find a way to keep living?" Robert closed his eyes, fresh tears streaming down his face. "He'd want me to be strong. He'd want me to honor him. I know that. But knowing it and doing it are different things." You won't believe what Jennifer did next. She stood up and extended her hand to Robert. "Then let me help you. You don't have to walk off this plane alone. I'll walk with you. We'll do it together." Robert looked at her hand, at her face showing genuine compassion and determination, and something in him shifted. He wasn't alone. This stranger, this flight attendant, who didn't know him or James, was offering to help carry his grief for these next few steps. That gift, that simple human kindness, gave him the strength he couldn't find on his own. He took her hand and stood up on shaking legs. Jennifer helped Robert gather his things, his carry-on, his coat, the photograph of James that he clutched like a lifeline. Together they walked slowly up the aisle toward the exit. Robert's steps were heavy, reluctant, each one taking him closer to a reality he didn't want to face. But Jennifer walked beside him, holding his arm, steadying him, her presence a quiet support. The other flight attendants watched with tears in their eyes, understanding now why Jennifer had insisted on giving this man time. This wasn't a difficult passenger. This was a father preparing to bury his son. As they reached the aircraft door, Robert stopped. He looked back down the cabin, toward the floor, toward the cargo hold beneath where James's coffin waited. "He's really down there," Robert said, as if just now fully comprehending it. "My boy is really dead." Jennifer squeezed his arm. "Yes, he is, and that's a pain you'll carry forever. But you'll carry it because you loved him. The pain is the price of love, and love is worth it, even when it ends in loss." Robert nodded, unable to speak, and let Jennifer lead him through the door into the jet bridge. The gate agent, who'd been irritated minutes ago, saw Robert's face and immediately understood. Her expression softened. "Sir, there are military personnel waiting for you at baggage claim. They'll help coordinate the transfer of your son's remains. I'm very sorry for your loss." Robert nodded mechanically, and Jennifer continued to walk with him through the terminal. Other passengers, seeing this man being escorted by a flight attendant, seeing his obvious distress, quietly made room, some offering sympathetic looks, others averting their eyes from pain too raw to witness. Aaron saw them emerge from the jet bridge and immediately recognized the man from 8A. Now he understood the delay, and he felt ashamed of his earlier annoyance. This man had been waiting to deplane because his son's body was in the cargo hold. How could anyone be annoyed by that? Aaron watched Jennifer walk Robert through the terminal with such gentle care, and he felt moved by her compassion, by her willingness to go beyond job requirements to help someone in profound pain. At baggage claim, 2 Marines in dress blue uniforms waited. When they saw Robert, they came to attention and saluted. "Mr. Morgan, we're here to assist with Lieutenant Morgan's transfer and to support you in any way you need, sir." Robert returned their salute, his hand shaking. Jennifer, her job technically done, prepared to leave. But Robert gripped her hand. "Please don't go yet. I can't," Jennifer nodded. "I'll stay as long as you need me." She turned to the Marines. "I'm Jennifer Park, flight attendant on the flight that carried Lieutenant Morgan. I'd like to stay with Mr. Morgan through the transfer, if that's acceptable. The Marines agreed immediately. Together, the group made their way to a private area of the airport, where military remains were received. Robert walked in a daze, Jennifer still holding his arm, the Marines flanking them with solemn respect. In the private receiving area, other military personnel waited along with a chaplain and a representative from the funeral home Robert had selected. Everything was organized, professional, designed to honor the fallen and support their families. But no amount of organization could make this moment less devastating. The cargo hold doors opened. A team of 6 Marines in dress blues approached the hold with a flag-draped transfer case on a ceremonial cart. They moved with precise, rehearsed dignity, and Robert's knees nearly buckled when he saw the flag. Jennifer held him up. "You can do this," she whispered. "Stay strong for James, just a little longer." Robert forced himself to stand upright as the Marines carefully removed the transfer case from the cargo hold and placed it on the cart. They saluted. The chaplain stepped forward and spoke words Robert barely heard through the roaring in his ears. Then it was over. The transfer case was loaded into the funeral home's vehicle. James was officially home, though not in any way Robert had ever wanted him to come home. The Marines offered to escort Robert to his hotel, but he declined. He needed to be alone now. Jennifer, sensing this, prepared to leave. "Thank you," Robert said to her, his voice rough. "Thank you for sitting with me, for walking with me, for being kind when you didn't have to be. I couldn't have done this without you." Jennifer hugged him. This stranger she'd helped through the worst moment of his life. Honor him, Robert. Grieve him, but keep living. That's what he'd want. You know it is. Robert nodded and watched Jennifer walk away. This angel who'd appeared exactly when he needed her. Then he turned to face the work ahead, planning a funeral for his son, notifying extended family, preparing to bury the last piece of his heart. But he felt marginally stronger now. Not because the pain was less, but because someone had witnessed it, shared it, helped carry it for a crucial moment. He wasn't alone in his grief. Jennifer had shown him that. And maybe, just maybe, that would be enough to get him through the darkest days ahead. Jennifer returned to her crew, who asked her about the delay. She explained about Robert, about James, about walking a grieving father through the worst moment of his life. Her colleagues were moved, several crying. "You went above and beyond," one said. Jennifer shook her head. "I just did what anyone should do when someone is suffering. I was present. I listened. I helped. That's not above and beyond. That's basic human decency." But her colleagues knew better. Many people would have followed protocol, forced the passenger off quickly, moved on without a second thought. Jennifer had chosen compassion over convenience. That mattered enormously. Aaron, who'd witnessed the scene at baggage claim, approached Jennifer before she left the airport. "I was on your flight, seat 11C. I saw what you did for that man. That was one of the most compassionate things I've ever witnessed. May I ask what was happening?" Jennifer hesitated, then decided the story deserved to be told. She explained about Robert, about James, about the cargo hold, and the refusal to deplane. Aaron felt tears in his eyes. "Can I write about this? I'm a journalist. This story needs to be shared. The compassion you showed, the sacrifice that young man made, the grief his father carries. People need to know." Jennifer considered. "Only if you focus on Robert and James. Not me. I'm not the story. They are." Aaron agreed, and spent the next week researching Lieutenant James Morgan. He discovered an exemplary young Marine who died trying to save his squad during a Taliban ambush. James had thrown himself on a grenade, absorbing the blast, saving 5 other Marines. He died instantly, but heroically. His CO said James embodied everything the Marines valued: courage, sacrifice, devotion to fellow Marines. The military was recommending him for the Medal of Honor posthumously. Aaron's article, titled "The Father Who Couldn't Leave the Plane: One Family's Sacrifice," went viral. It told James's story of heroism, Robert's story of devastating loss, and Jennifer's story of compassionate service. Readers were moved to tears, sharing the article millions of times. Comments poured in from other Gold Star families, from veterans, from people who'd lost loved ones and understood Robert's inability to face finality. The article sparked conversations about grief, sacrifice, the cost of war, and the importance of compassion for those who suffer. Robert Morgan read the article through tears, grateful that James's sacrifice was being honored, that people knew his son's name and story. But he also reached out to Jennifer, wanting to thank her again and to update her on his journey. They met for coffee 3 months after that terrible day at the airport. Robert looked better. Still sad, always sad now, but functional, moving forward. "I buried James with full military honors," Robert told Jennifer. "It was beautiful and terrible, but I got through it, and I'm getting through each day after. It's hard, but I'm doing it." Jennifer held Robert's hand across the table. "James would be proud of you. You're honoring him by living, By surviving this, by finding a way forward. Robert nodded. I've started volunteering with Gold Star families, helping other parents who've lost children in military service. Sharing my experience, offering support. It helps. Helping others helps me. I learned that from you. You helped me when I needed it most. Now I try to do the same for others. It gives me purpose. It makes James's death not meaningless. It'll never make sense. But I can make something good come from it, by supporting others who are suffering. Jennifer felt honored to have played a part in Robert's journey. You're doing exactly what you should be doing, turning your grief into service. That's beautiful. They stayed in contact after that, meeting occasionally. Robert updating Jennifer on his volunteer work. Jennifer sharing how his story had impacted her own approach to the job. She was more attentive now to passenger pain, more willing to break protocol when compassion required it. Robert had taught her that some things matter more than schedules and rules. Human suffering matters more. Connection matters more. Being present for someone in crisis matters more. 5 years after that rainy Tuesday evening, the Pentagon announced that Lieutenant James Morgan was being awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously for his actions in Afghanistan. Robert attended the White House ceremony where the president hung the medal around a portrait of James and spoke about his sacrifice. Robert stood surrounded by military dignitaries, James's Marine Corps family, and Jennifer, whom he'd invited to witness this honor. When Robert accepted the medal on James's behalf, he spoke briefly to the assembled crowd. My son died doing what he loved, serving his country and protecting his brothers in arms. I'm proud of him beyond words, but I won't pretend his death doesn't destroy me every single day. It does. I miss him with every breath. But I've learned that grief and pride can coexist. I'm shattered by his loss and honored by his service. Both are true. I want to thank everyone who supported me through the darkest time of my life, especially Jennifer Park, who walked me off a plane when I couldn't face what was waiting. She showed me that we don't get through tragedies alone. We need each other. So to everyone suffering loss, reach out, accept help, let others walk with you through the unbearable moments. That's how we survive, together. The audience, including hardened military officers, wiped their eyes. Jennifer, sitting in the crowd, cried openly. Robert had transformed his grief into wisdom, his pain into service, his loss into legacy. James was gone, but his sacrifice was remembered. His father was surviving, and the ripples of both their lives spread outward, touching others, inspiring others, reminding everyone of the cost of freedom and the power of compassion. Aaron attended the Medal of Honor ceremony and wrote a follow-up article. 5 years later, the father who couldn't leave the plane receives his son's Medal of Honor. The article updated readers on Robert's journey, on Jennifer's continued service, on how one moment of compassion had created a lasting connection that helped a grieving father survive the unsurvivable. Comments flooded in from readers who remembered the original story, who'd followed Robert's journey, who were inspired by his resilience. Many mentioned implementing more compassion in their own lives after reading about Jennifer. The stories had impact beyond one family, changing how people thought about grief, service, and human connection. The airline recognized Jennifer's exceptional service to Robert with their highest internal award for employee excellence. At the ceremony, Jennifer again deflected credit. I just sat with someone who was suffering, that's all. Anyone could have done it. But the airline president disagreed. Many people could have, but you did. You chose compassion over convenience, connection over protocol. That represents the best of who we are as an airline and as humans. Thank you for showing us how to serve not just passengers, but people. The other employees gave Jennifer a standing ovation, many thinking about how they could emulate her compassion in their own roles. 10 years after Lieutenant James Morgan's death, Robert stood at his son's grave on the anniversary of his burial. The grief was different now, not less, but changed, integrated into his life rather than overwhelming it. He'd learned to carry it, to function despite it, to even find joy sometimes while still honoring his son's memory. Robert had remarried, a woman who'd also lost a child and understood his grief. Together they'd created a new life, not replacing what was lost but building something new alongside the loss. James would always be absent, but Robert was learning that absence doesn't prevent presence in other forms, memories, legacy, impact. Jennifer attended the 10th anniversary memorial service Robert organized for James. She stood among dozens of people whose lives James had touched, fellow Marines, childhood friends, family members, and Gold Star families Robert had supported through his volunteer work. Robert gave a speech reflecting on a decade of grief and growth. James has been dead for 10 years. I've lived 10 years without him. Some days that feels impossible. How have I survived 10 years without my son? But I have. Not because the pain lessened, but because I found purpose in the pain, helping other grieving parents, honoring James's memory, accepting help from people like Jennifer, who walked with me through the darkest valley. That's how we survive loss, not alone, but together, supporting each other, bearing witness to each other's pain, refusing to let grief isolate us. The attendees were moved by Robert's words, by his transformation from a man who couldn't leave a plane to a man who'd built a life around honoring his son and helping others. Jennifer, listening to Robert, felt proud to have played a small part in his journey. That single decision to sit with him, to give him time, to walk him through his grief rather than forcing him into it, that decision had mattered, had changed Robert's trajectory, had possibly saved his life, since he'd admitted during their coffee meetings that he'd contemplated suicide in those first terrible weeks. Jennifer's compassion had been a lifeline when Robert had nothing else to hold on to. Aaron's final article about Robert and James, published on the 10th anniversary of James's death, reflected on legacy and resilience. Lieutenant James Morgan died heroically at 23, saving his squad from a grenade blast. His father, Robert, almost died from grief, but Robert survived, helped by a compassionate flight attendant who understood that sometimes people need time before facing the unbearable. 10 years later, Robert has turned his loss into purpose, supporting other Gold Star families, honoring James's memory through service. James's legacy isn't just his Medal of Honor, it's the lives his father has touched, the parents Robert has helped survive their own losses, the ripples of compassion that spread from one terrible moment. That's immortality, not living forever, but impacting others so profoundly that your influence never ends. The article resonated deeply with readers, many of whom were facing their own losses and needed to hear Robert's message. Grief doesn't end, but you can survive it. Pain can coexist with purpose. Loss doesn't have to destroy you if you accept help and eventually help others. Robert's journey from the man who couldn't leave the plane to the man who helped dozens of other grieving parents became a roadmap for transformation through tragedy. 15 years after that rainy Tuesday, Jennifer retired from flying. At her retirement party, Robert attended along with several Gold Star families he'd supported over the years. Robert gave a speech honoring Jennifer's impact, not just on his life, but on the broader community of grieving military families. Jennifer showed me that compassion is an action, not just a feeling. She acted when I needed help most, and she taught me to do the same for others. Every family I've helped, every grieving parent I've supported, is part of Jennifer's legacy because she showed me how one person's compassion can save a life. Thank you, Jennifer, for saving mine. Jennifer, crying as she'd cried so many times through this journey with Robert, hugged him tightly. You saved yourself, Robert. I just walked with you for a few steps. You did the hard work of surviving, of building a new life, of helping others. That's all you. But Robert shook his head. I couldn't have taken those first steps without you. Never underestimate the power of walking with someone through their darkest moment. You gave me hope when I had none. You showed me kindness when I felt unworthy of it. You saved my life that day on the plane. Everything I've done since flows from that moment. That's your legacy. Aaron, who'd followed this story for 15 years, writing updates and check-ins with Robert's permission, published his final article, The Man Who Couldn't Leave the Plane, 15 Years of Grief, Growth, and Grace. The article traced the entire journey from that first terrible moment when Robert couldn't face leaving the aircraft, through Jennifer's compassion, through the Medal of Honor, through Robert's transformation into a support for other grieving parents, through 15 years of learning to live with unbearable loss. Robert Morgan taught us that grief doesn't end, Aaron wrote, but it can evolve. It can drive us to help others, to honor our lost loved ones through service, to transform our worst pain into our deepest purpose. And Jennifer Park taught us that small acts of compassion have enormous ripples. She gave a grieving father 20 extra minutes on a plane and walked him through the worst moment of his life. That kindness 15 years ago is still impacting lives today through the families Robert has helped, the support he's provided, the hope he's shared. Never underestimate the power of compassion. Never underestimate what sitting with someone in their pain can mean. Sometimes it means everything. Lieutenant James Morgan had been dead for 15 years. But his legacy lived on through his father's survival and service, through the Gold Star families Robert had helped, through the lessons about compassion that Jennifer had taught by example, through the thousands of readers who'd been moved by their story and chosen kindness in their own lives as a result. James had died at 23, his life tragically short, but his impact was eternal, multiplied through his father's pain transformed into purpose, through a flight attendant's choice to value people over schedules, through a journalist's decision to share their story with the world. Robert stood at James's grave on what would have been his 38th birthday, imagining the man his son would have become. A career Marine probably, maybe married, maybe with children of his own, all the futures James would never have. But Robert had learned to honor the life James did live rather than mourning only the life he didn't. 23 years of James's laughter, kindness, courage, service. 23 years of being Robert's son. That was worth celebrating, even as the loss of more years was worth grieving. "I miss you every day," Robert said to the headstone marked with James's name and the Medal of Honor citation. "But I've kept going. I've helped other dads survive losing their kids. I've honored your memory by living the way you lived, serving others, being brave, refusing to give up. I hope I've made you proud, son. I hope wherever you are you know your death wasn't meaningless. You saved your squad that day, and your death inadvertently taught me and thousands of others about grief and resilience and compassion. That's your legacy, James. You changed the world in 23 years more than most people do in 80. I love you, I'm proud of you, and I'll keep living for both of us until we meet again." Jennifer, visiting Robert that day to lay flowers on James's grave alongside him, heard his words and squeezed his shoulder. 15 years after walking him off that plane, she was still walking with him, still bearing witness to his grief and his growth. That was friendship forged in crisis, bonds that lasted lifetimes. Robert and Jennifer would be connected forever by that terrible, beautiful moment when compassion met grief and refused to let it destroy a good man. Together they stood at the grave, honoring James, celebrating his life, acknowledging his loss, and recommitting to living with purpose because of him. That's the story of Flight 712 and the man who couldn't leave the plane. A story of devastating loss and surprising compassion, of a father's grief and a flight attendant's kindness, of a hero who died too young and the ripples of his sacrifice that spread for years, of pain transformed into purpose, of trauma that didn't destroy but somehow, mysteriously, created connection and meaning. Robert Morgan survived the death of his son, not because the pain ended, but because someone walked with him through it when he couldn't walk alone. That's the power of presence, of compassion, of refusing to leave someone isolated in their suffering. Jennifer Park gave Robert 20 extra minutes on a plane, and her presence during the hardest walk of his life. 15 years later, that gift was still giving to Robert, to the families he'd helped, to everyone whose life was touched by their story. Small acts of kindness create eternal ripples. That's the lesson. That's the legacy. That's why their story matters, and always will.